So this is the in-class activity for Chapter 8, the appendicular skeleton. So question 1 says, look at the x-ray below. What bones and bone markings can you identify? So first, to orient you, we are looking at a shoulder joint. So we can see the clavicle, which runs right here. We can also see the scapula in the back. You can also see some ribs, which I'm not going to label since they were part of the axial skeleton, and then we're going to talk about the humerus in a minute. But if we look at the clavicle and scapula, you can see that this end up here of the clavicle is the acromial end, and I've drawn a little line around it. The sternal end, which is the part that actually forms a joint with the sternum, is out of view. And the acromial end, if you remember, is the part of the clavicle that forms a joint with the scapula. And the reason it's called the acromial end is because the structure on the scapula that it forms a joint with is called the acromion, and I've highlighted that for you. And the acromion is going to continue until it becomes the spine, which runs along the back or the posterior side of the scapula, which we can't see in this x-ray. And another structure that you can see in this x-ray down here, it's a process that's coming straight out at you, and if I highlight it for you, that is the coracoid process, which is also a structure on the scapula. So this is the humerus over here, so that is your upper arm bone, and this is the head of the humerus that's going to form the ball and socket joint of your shoulder. And the head of the humerus is forming a joint or articulation with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And so that is this slight depression on the lateral side of the scapula. Number 2, while we won't specifically talk about joints until Chapter 9, look at the picture below showing the elbow. Label the bones and the bone markings involved in the elbow joint. All right, so let's start with naming the major bones. So the humerus is shown up here at the top. You have the radius over here, and I can tell the shape of the radius because it has like a nail-shaped head, and it's larger at the distal end. And then this is the ulna, and the ulna has that C-shaped trochlea at the top, which you can't really see in this image because the joint's all put together, but the ulna also narrows at the distal end. Another clue that could help me tell these two apart is the ulna is always going to be medial, the radius will always be lateral. And if I go back up to my humerus, I've got these two epicondyles, which are the extensions on either side of the condyle. And if you remember, the medial epicondyle is the largest of the two. So see how this one is much larger than that one? And because that's the medial epicondyle, that tells me this is the medial side. Therefore, this has to be the ulna down here because the ulna is on the medial side. And then this would be the lateral epicondyle, which is going to be on the same side as the radius because the radius is lateral. And then if I look at the connections between the humerus and the ulna, the trochlea is the region that is going to form a joint with the ulna. So the ulna has that C-shaped trochlear notch that will wrap around the trochlea on the humerus. And then the capitulum is this round marble-like structure that forms a joint with the head of the radius. And remember that the capitulum and the trochlea together make up the condyle of the humerus. But on exams and stuff, we're probably going to ask you to be specific and actually know the difference between the capitulum and the trochlea. So let's take a closer look at the radius and the ulna. So as I mentioned, this is the head of the radius. It's got a, looks like the head of a nail. The radial tuberosity, or the tuberosity of the radius, is going to be this bump on the anterior side just below the head. This is where the biceps brachii muscle will actually insert. And then the radius at the distal end has a styloid process, which is this little extension off of the bottom. This is that bump you feel in your wrist at the base of your thumb. The ulna also has a head, but the radial head is on the proximal side. The ulnar head is on the distal end. So notice the heads are on opposite ends. So the head of the ulna is down here by the wrist. And the ulna also has a little styloid process that's going to form the medial side of your wrist, which is on the same side as your little pinky. The ulna also has a few structures up here that we can't really see because the bones are put together. There is a radial notch right here where the head of the radius forms a joint with the ulna, and then there's the trochlear notch, which is the part that is the C-shaped part that's wrapping around the trochlea of the humerus, and then on the back side is the olecranon, which is the point of the elbow. Number 3, look at the x-ray below. What bones and bone markings can you identify? So this is a hand, and one really cool feature of this x-ray is that you can see a sesamoid bone. Remember, these are tiny bones that are very variable from one person to another, and they form in tendons. But if we get back to the bones of the hand, let's start down at the wrist area. So you can see the radius down here. Again, remember when you're looking at the distal end of the forearm, the radius is going to be larger at the distal end and the ulna is going to be smaller. The radius is also going to be lateral, which is going to be the same side as your thumb, and the ulna is also going to be medial, which is the same side as your little finger. So this would be the ulna on this end, and I've actually put the arrow right on top of the head of the ulna, so I don't have it labeled separately, but you can make a note that that is also the head of the ulna. So I can also see the styloid process of the radius, and as I mentioned before, this is that bump you can feel in your wrist at the base of your thumb, and the ulna also has a little styloid process on the pinky side of your wrist. So 2 styloid processes, and then there was a styloid process on the temporal bone, if you remember from chapter 7. This group of bones is the carpals. So you have 8 total carpals, and they are approximately in 2 rows, 4 in the proximal row and 4 in the distal row. And then these bones in the palm of your hand are your metacarpals, and we label them 1 through 5 using Roman numerals. And we start from the lateral side, so we start from the side of your thumb. So this would be metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, and metacarpal 5. And then if we look at the bones in the fingers, so over here we have the proximal phalanx of the pollex. Remember, the pollex is an anatomical term for the thumb. And we have a distal phalanx of the pollex. So remember, the thumb or the pollex is the one finger that only has 2 phalanges. So a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx. It does not have a middle phalanx. So if we look at your other 4 fingers, they will all have proximal phalanges. So those are the ones I've shaded in red. They will all have middle phalanges, shaded in green. And they will all have distal phalanges shaded in yellow. So there are 14 total phalanges or finger bones in each hand. Question 4, look at the x-ray below. What bones and bone markings can you identify? So this is an image of the knee joint, in case you were wondering. So if we look at the bones, the major bones we can identify, this is the femur at the top, the largest and heaviest bone in the body. This is a tibia at the bottom. That is the second largest and heaviest bone of the body. You can also see the fibula over here on the left. Another bone you can see here is the patella. That is your kneecap. It's another sesamoid bone that forms in the membrane of the quadriceps femoris. And you can see it's very faint, but if you look carefully, you can see the outline of it. And I'm pointing it out for you before I actually throw a line on top of it, but there I've outlined it for you. So that's the patella. It has a base, is its widest part at the top, and an apex, which is the pointier part at the bottom. Behind the patella on the femur is where you have your patellar surface. And so that is the smooth surface on the femur where the patella will articulate by moving slightly superiorly and inferiorly. You can also see the head of the fibula down here. And then now let's look at the actual joint between the femur and the tibia. So you have the lateral condyle of the femur which forms a joint with the lateral condyle of the tibia. And in this view, I know that this is my lateral side because I can see the fibula. And remember, the fibula is always lateral and the tibia is always medial. So that tells me this is my lateral side, this is my medial side. Therefore, this is the medial condyle of the femur, which is going to form an articulation with the medial condyle of the tibia. So hopefully those should be easy to remember. And then in between the two condyles on the tibia, you see this little structure that looks like a mountain range. That is the intercondylar eminence, and that is on the tibia. And again, intercondylar means between the condyles, and an eminence is a reference to like a little ridge-like structure. I think it looks like a mountain range. There is also an intercondylar fossa on the posterior side of the femur. So it's between these two condyles on the back side, so we can't see it on this x-ray. Number 5, look at the x-ray below. What bones and bone markings can you identify? If we start with the bones, well, actually this is an ankle joint, in case you were wondering. This is the tibia, again the second largest and heaviest bone in the body. And this would be the fibula. So again, that's going to tell me this is the medial side, same side as the tibia, and the fibula is always on the lateral side. So when I get down to the ankle itself, the talus is the ankle bone that forms a joint with the tibia, and it is one of your 7 tarsal bones. But because I see it sitting right here underneath the tibia, I know this is the talus. And then this x-ray isn't clear enough to differentiate between the other tarsals. I can also see the lateral malleolus of the fibula. This forms your outer ankle bump, so the bump at your ankle on the outside of your legs. And over here we have the medial malleolus, which is on the tibia, and this is the ankle bump on the inside of your legs on the same side as your big toe. Number 6 says, what is meant by girdle? What bones belong to the pectoral girdle? What bones belong to the pelvic girdle? So remember, in anatomy with reference to the skeleton, a girdle is the bones or bone that connect the axial skeleton to the appendicular skeleton. So the pectoral girdle is going to be connecting the upper limbs to the axial skeleton. And the pectoral girdle is made up of the clavicle and scapula. There are 2 of each, 1 on each side. The connection to the axial skeleton is going to be where the clavicle articulates with the sternum. So it's the sternal end of the clavicle and it's the manubrium of the sternum. This is called the claviculosternal joint, and this is a type of gliding joint. When we get into chapter 9, we're going to talk about types of joints. The pectoral girdle's connection with the appendicular skeleton is where the scapula articulates with the humerus. So it's the glenoid cavity of the scapula forming a joint with the head of the humerus. This is called the glenohumeral joint, and this is a type of ball and socket joint. The bone that makes up the pelvic girdle is the hip bone. You have 2 of these, 1 on each side. These can also be referred to as coxal bones, C-O-X-A-L, or also os coxae. The pelvic girdle connects with the axial skeleton where the hip articulates with the sacrum. So if you remember, the auricular surface on the ilium is the connection point of that hip bone to the sacrum. And this is called the sacroiliac joint, and this is also a gliding joint. And then the pelvic girdle connects to the appendicular skeleton where the hip articulates with the femur. So it's the acetabulum on the hip, and it's going to articulate with the head of the femur. And this forms the joint called the hip joint, and this is a ball and socket joint. Number 7, look at the 2 pelvises below. Which one is the male pelvis? Which one is the female pelvis? How can you tell? Again, just a reminder to be careful with terminology, because when we say pelvis, we actually are referring to 4 bones that are connected: the left and right hip bones, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So the pelvis refers to all 4 bones. All right, let's look at this one on the top left. We can see that the ilium is broader and projecting more laterally. whereas the one on the top right, the ilium extends farther superiorly and it's more narrow. We can also see on the left that the pubic angle is greater than 100 degrees. That's the angle between the two pubic bones. On the right side, the pubic angle is less than 90 degrees. The pelvic inlet in the one on the left is oval and round in shape and a little bit larger, whereas the pelvic inlet on the right side is more heart-shaped and narrow. On the left side, we have the sacrum with much less curvature, and it's more curved on the right side. And then we also see on the left side that the coccyx points inferiorly, whereas on the right side, the coccyx points anteriorly. So if all of that should allow you to tell which is the male pelvis and which is the female pelvis. If my color coding didn't already give it away, the pelvis on the left side is the female and the pelvis on the right side is the male pelvis. Number 8, look at the x-ray below. What bones and bone markings can you identify? Differentiate between the longitudinal and transverse arches. So we'll start down here with the tibia. You also see a little bit of the fibula here, but since it's got the word oblique over top of it, I didn't label it. You can also see a little of it here, except I've labeled a part of that. So you can also see the tarsals. So remember, there are 7 tarsals, and you only need to know the names of 2 of them. And the 2 that you need to know are the talus, which is going to be the one right underneath the tibia, and the calcaneus, which is going to be underneath the talus, and it also extends backward to form your heel. You can also see the medial malleolus of the tibia over here. That's your inside ankle bump. And you can see the lateral malleolus of the fibula, which makes up your lateral or outer ankle bump. We can also see the metatarsals, which make up the sole of the foot. These are also numbered 1 through 5 using Roman numerals, but this time we're going to start on the medial side, or the same side as the big toe. So this would be metatarsal 1, metatarsal 2, metatarsal 3, metatarsal 4, and metatarsal 5. We can also see the hallux, which is another name for the big toe, and the hallux only has 2 phalanges. So this one that I've labeled here would be the distal phalanx of the hallux on both sides, and this would be the proximal phalanx of the hallux. And then if we look at the other 4 toes, they each have a proximal phalanx, so there are 8 proximal phalanges. The ones colored in green are the middle phalanges, and the ones in yellow are the distal phalanges. So just like the hand, each foot has 14 phalanges. Then if we look at the arches, the arch that runs from the lateral to the medial side and vice versa is called the transverse arch. And then you also have a longitudinal arch, which runs from the calcaneus or heel bone up to the distal end of the metatarsals. And there are 2 of these. There is the lateral longitudinal arch, which is going to be on the same side as your little toe. And there is the medial longitudinal arch, which will be on the same side as your big toe. Number 9, label the hip bones, which is the medial view, which is the lateral view. So let's first identify, well actually let's first point out that these are both views of a right hip bone. So it's the same bone, it's just one has been flipped over to see the other side. And so to determine which is medial and which is lateral, we are going to first identify the 3 bones that fuse together during development to make this overall hip bone. And they include the ilium, which is shown in the beige color. This is the top blade part. You also have the pubis, which is going to be anteriorly, so it's going to be closer to the front. So this would tell me that this is the front and this is the back. And then you have the ischium, which is the one that is more posterior. So this will tell me again this is posterior and posterior. So then when I'm trying to determine medial versus lateral, there are 2 features that can help me. One is I can find the auricular surface on the ilium. This is the point at which the ilium will actually form a joint with the sacrum, and it's only visible on one side, and it's always going to be on the medial side of the hip bone. Then I can also see the acetabulum, which is this deep depression where the head of the femur is going to fit and make a joint. And another piece of information to remember is that the acetabulum is always on the lateral side. So that tells me that the left picture is a medial view and the right picture is a lateral view. So if we look at a few more of the structures that we learned, the iliac crest is the topmost part of the ilium, so it's the literal crest on top of the bone. The iliac fossa is only visible on the anterior portion of the hip bone, so this would be posterior, lateral, and posterior. This is medial and anterior, so it would only be over here. You can see on the right side when you have the lateral view, it's not as smooth. There's some other bumps and ridges on that blade. So this really smooth area that's on the ilium is called the iliac fossa, and again, it's only on the anterior side. You also have the greater sciatic notch, which is this big notch structure here, also on the ilium. This is the structure that the sciatic nerve will pass through. And then you have the lesser sciatic notch, which is the smaller notch on the ischium, and other blood vessels and nerves will pass through this little area. You also can see the ischial tuberosity on the posterior side, so on the back of the ischium. This is the part that bears all of your weight when you are sitting down. And then we have the obturator foramen, which is this large hole that forms between the pubis and the ischium. This will be covered with a membrane made of collagen fibers, and you will also have a little canal in here where blood vessels and nerves can pass through. We can also see the spot on the pubis where we will have the pubis symphysis. So this is where a little pad of fibrocartilage would sit that will connect the left hip bone to the right hip bone. And that is it for the Chapter 7 activity, or Chapter 8 activity, excuse me. Happy studying!